Isn't that neat? Yeah. Why do we bring a science video to this forum when we're talking about a faithful man? It's this, is that isn't God faithful? He's faithful in the fact that something that you and I will never be able to do. He did. He does. We get the benefit of taking advantage of his design, his innovation, and what you saw there, something that will keep life inside of us. God is faithful. God is faithful that we get to take advantage on something that I'm just going to say probably this half the room understands, but that half doesn't in that video. God is faithful, isn't he? God is faithful. Well, good evening and welcome everybody to Men's Thursday. Man, we're so happy that you're here, and I am so happy that I've got an opportunity to be with you to open this part of the series. Not because I love speaking in front of people, not because I have anything to say, but because I get a breakfast and a dinner. It's that simple. It's that simple. If you're new here this week, I just say welcome. You're in the right place. Even though we call this part 2 of a series, you haven't missed anything. Because we're taking messages, we're doing them standalone, so don't feel like you've missed out on anything up to this point. You're here at the right time. If you guys have been with us from the beginning, when we started this series a couple months back, you realize that we've talked about some really, really heavy things, some incredible godly attributes that you and I need to strive to reach. And so I encourage all of you, whether, again, you're just brand new or you've been here from the beginning, is to log into the app. If you go to the Thursday tab in the Men's app, scroll down, you'll see the previous series. It has all the notes from the 7 series that we did prior, the 7 weeks, with all the blanks filled in, the questions that we discussed. So if you want to go back and talk about some of those topics, you can, or if you want to review them, they're available to you through the Men's app. But as we start this series, I do want to take a look back, just so that we can kind of level set a little bit on where we came from. So these are the topics we talked about. If you were here the very first week when Brent kicked us off, we talked about this topic of discipline. And Brent described it in the context of athletes and going to the gym. We know that if we don't go to the gym and lift weights or whatever, we're not going to grow muscle. And it takes discipline. It takes us to do that consistently and intentionally to get the results. The following week, we talked about peacemaking and the causes and sources of contentiousness that live in our environment today. You and I don't know what it is. I don't know what's happening. I mean, I have my ideas, but we live in a very contentious time. You can't pick up your phone, you can't turn on TV, you can't read a newspaper without some sort of conflict and contention going on. So peacemaking is such a critical piece of the attributes that we need because of who we worship and who we follow. The following week after that, we talked about justice. We went from the very beginning of the Bible and the Old Testament, and we walked all the way through to Jesus to talk about what living a just life looks like. Then we talked about fathering. We asked the age-old question, the question that's been plaguing mankind since the beginning: who's your daddy? You can't make this stuff up, people. I'm just telling you. The following week, we talked about generosity, and generosity being more than just putting money into an offering bin, but how we use our time and how we use our talents. Then we talked about temperance and the things that trigger us to anger and trigger us to revenge. And then we close the series talking about selflessness and really how we need to all strive to not be so self-willed in the life we live, but try instead to be selfless in all areas of our life. So what's cool for us is we get to tackle some new topics this series. So what you're going to see is today we're going to talk about being a faithful man, kind of trying to bring all these attributes together, but we're going to talk about some new things. We're going to talk about living a balanced life. And so Jason, there he is. So Jason next week is going to come up and talk about that very topic. So you don't want to miss that. Then we're going to talk about how to handle anger. We're going to talk about being moderate in all things, demonstrating wisdom, sharing resources, and then the capper, maintaining moral purity. I know a lot of you are probably looking at your calendar right now, doing the math to say, oh, that's the week that I'm sure I'm doing something. Can I just encourage you, is we live in a time that we are struggling with that, and we can't talk about it enough. So I encourage each and every one of you in this room, be a finisher. Get to that end, have that conversation so that we can see what God's take is on maintaining moral purity. So as we kick off today, talking about a faithful man, we're going to go into the Word and look at what Paul's outline for us has been, how we started this series, what this series is based on. We're going to look at part of that verse again. And a lot of you know that when Paul writes his letters, he's writing it in a period of time where he's building up his church. Well, can I be honest with you today and say, you know what? Today, we're building up the church. Today, we still have the same mission that Paul had when this whole thing started 2,000 years ago. And so as we look at what that looks like, and we look at how we need to do this in a proper way, we come back to really the whole reasoning behind men's ministry. You talk to Brent, Adam, you talk to Ron, you know that at the heart, this is what we are trying to do in men's ministry, is this Bible verse. This is taken out of 2 Timothy chapter 1, but talking about the Word of God here specifically, talking about the words that we're going to look at in a minute, but he wants us to equip you for every good work. And if you want to replace that every good work with God's will or God's purpose, please do so. Because that's really what we're doing. We're trying to equip you to be the man that you need to be the godly warrior that God called you to be. So let's take a look at the verse. There's a lot of blanks to fill in. Sorry. But I'm going to leave this slide up for a while so you don't have a problem filling in all those blanks. But you also have your Bible so you can look and fill them in accordingly if you need to. But let's read this verse. This is coming from 1 Timothy chapter 3, starting with the first verse. Whoever aspires to be an overseer. So just a quick comment. Overseer, you can substitute the word leader in this particular instance. So whoever aspires to be a leader desires a noble task. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him. And he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. Can anybody say that, you know what, I got all of those things, I'm good. This is no issue for me? Okay, just checking. Okay, I'm watching you. I'm watching you, Rod. God wants us to be the man that he created, designed us to be. What he doesn't want us to be is the opposite of everything that's said in here, which is what the media today has been portraying men to be. They portray men to be pleasure-seeking animals, passive fathers, self-obsessed knuckleheads, the butt of every joke. But he wants us to be warriors, doesn't he? He wants us to be about things of him, not the media, not the world. And he wants us to be these men that are equipped for every good work, for the godly influence for those that he has put around each and every one of you. I'm assuming everybody in this room is not alone in some way, that you've been placed in a position where you have people around you that may know Jesus, may not, but you've been placed in a position of godly influence to those people's lives. And this is the standard of that leader. So with all that said, anybody intimidated, discouraged, threatened, or overwhelmed by the list we read? Thank you. Me too. Me too. Some of you are probably in this room thinking, I was in church on Sunday, and Pastor Lynn actually referred to this verse, but he referred to it as a pastoral qualification. And maybe some of you, if you have your Bibles and you're looking, you could probably see that the word overseer has been translated as elder or some other big fancy church word. And if you tell me this, I'm going to say, you're right. This was written to the first church leaders, to the first establishment of the church that Paul was writing to. Paul in the books of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, and a little bit of Philemon, but these are the books that we know as the pastoral epistles. Pastoral meaning pastor, or looking at it from a church perspective, and epistle is just letter. These are the letters that Paul wrote to establish the foundations when the church first was getting started. So it made sense that he was trying to put together these attributes to be able to speak into the lives of the people that were going to make the church and has made the church what it is today. The fact that you and I get to be in this room today and this day at Cornerstone. But let me tell you this. Each and every one of you has been placed in some kind of leadership position. You've been placed at a job with other people. You've been placed in a family. And if you aren't in a family today, maybe you'll be one at some point, meaning kids and everything else. You've been placed in a neighborhood. You live somewhere. You've been placed in these situations where you have a group of friends, you have a group of people, but you've all been placed in a situation where you are a leader and you have an opportunity to be a church leader to them. Because you're in this room, I'm assuming that you have a basis of understanding of church and you're here for a reason. So I encourage you guys to think as yourselves as church leaders. Paul gives us an extremely high bar to reach. And just as we saw this video where we saw the faithfulness of God, you realize that you and I should strive to be faithful to Him. Faithful to the people that He loves. Your wife, your girlfriend, your friends, the people at your table, the people in your lives. So if you read the list that we had up here, and you feel overwhelmed like me, and you're wondering, how in the world can I do this? Can I just tell you two things? Number one, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt you can do it. But you can't do it alone. And I know this because I tried. I tried to do this alone. Very early in my life, I felt called when I was in high school to go into ministry. And I went to a Christian high school. I went to Christian grade school. I went to Christian college to become a pastor. And life kind of happened. To make a really long story short, I got married, started having babies. And I got to a point where when I looked at my life, I realized that I'm giving God all of this, but there were some things over here that I needed to hold on to. That and these are my words looking back, I didn't trust God with. And on that one little decision in my life started a series of slow steps, slow fade into sin. So much so that I turned away from my calling at that time and decided that I could do this myself. And in that process, I was not a faithful man. I was nowhere near a godly warrior. In fact, I wasn't a faithful husband. I had an affair on my wife. I put myself in positions that I should never have put myself into. And I had no regrets or no remorse in the moment. I wasn't a faithful dad. I put every other priority above my family. Work, the things that I wanted to do, golf, whatever that was my priority, and it wasn't to be a faithful dad. I wasn't a faithful friend, and in fact, the reality is I didn't have any friends. That should tell you something right there, right? I wasn't a faithful follower of Christ. I wasn't a faithful employee, and I wasn't a faithful neighbor. You guys heard the saying, good fences make good neighbors. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I loved good fences because that meant I could take things in my backyard that I didn't want to deal with and throw it over the fence to my neighbor. And that fence blocked it off so you couldn't see me do it. And strategically, because things come together, if I'm standing in the corner, it could be any one of those three people. Yes, I thought about it. That's not a faithful neighbor. And looking back at my life and where I was, I felt in the moment, as I look back, is that the bar that I set in my life, the standards that I was reaching for, the attributes that we're talking about, I set the bar to reach those extremely low because I could reach it. I could touch that bar. I could do it. And what I know is this, is that a faithful man is one who sets that bar high. Why? Because if we set it too low, like I did, there is no room for God. If we set it too low, we are doing it on our own power, and we're not letting God, we're not giving him room to show up in what we do and how we do it. 1 Timothy 3 sets an extremely high bar for us. And I think Paul knew a few things as he was putting this together that I think are important for us to know. First and foremost, Paul knew that he wasn't going to be around these churches all the time. That he needed to put people in roles of position to be able to take the church forward without a constant management or micromanagement of him being involved in it. And number two, he knew that a faithful man to the godly attributes would equal a faithful man towards God. You find it interesting that the attributes that we read and the things that we're looking at have nothing to do with spirituality directly? But the interesting part is they all have a lot to do with spirituality if we're doing those things right. Because if we do these attributes right in our day-to-day life, you realize that spills into our spiritual life. It spills into how we interact with people. It has a meshing effect in our lives. And so Paul could trust that if he found people with these attributes, he could trust them to be the faithful man and run his church that he was establishing through Timothy and through Titus and others. And then number three, he knew that a low bar could lead to complacency. And that's my story. My bar was so low, as I mentioned, that I didn't have to reach anything. I didn't have any goals. I didn't care about getting better. I just cared about what I could do, and led me down a road that forever changed my life. When I started in men's ministry, attending as a attender of men's ministry events at Cornerstone, this is some time ago, back in the early to mid 2000s. I was broken. I was rebuilding. I realized that the bar was too low, and I realized I needed to do something about that. But what was interesting is when I looked at the bar, it was so high for me that I said, man, I can't do this. I can't. There is no way in the world that I can reach that high bar. And I was in a room with a bunch of men that were seemingly doing it right. A bunch of mature, Christ-following men. And as I sat at a table similar to this, I thought to myself, man, I don't belong here. I feel insignificant. I feel hopeless. I'm just not worthy to be in the same room. And then during one of the sessions, a guy came up to the front of the room to speak. And he talked about how he was not a faithful man, how he wasn't a faithful father. He wasn't a faithful husband. He wasn't a faithful friend. And then he talked about the fact of he knew that he needed to change and what he learned from that particular moment that he needed to do. And it came down to two things. He recognized, and this is what I pulled from it, he recognized the fact that, number one, he needed God's help. To reach that high bar, we can't do it ourselves. And in his testimony, he said we needed God's help to reach that high bar. And then number two, he recognized the fact that he needed other men around him to help him, lift him up to reach that high bar as well. After hearing this, in a room full of men, fighting back the tears, I did not have low T at the time, people, I'm just telling you, it was real tears. I knew that I needed to change the bar from where I could reach it to where there was room for God. But most importantly, I knew that I needed to ask him in to help me reach that bar. So I started to pray. I started to ask God to help me be a faithful man. I started to talk at tables exactly like these. In fact, I think these are the same ones from back then. We reuse a lot here at Cornerstone. But I started talking at tables just like these. I started to volunteer in men's ministry and got involved. I started to learn and seek a closer relationship with Christ, spending time in my spiritual disciplines to seek him and what he had for me. I started to talk to my wife and my family, my friends, my neighbors, my coworkers. My life slowly started to change. And today, many years later, I'm just being honest with you, I haven't reached the bar. I'm still reaching for it. But what I do know is that today, I'm a faithful husband. I love my wife more now than I've ever loved her. She's my best friend. And by God's grace, we are going to celebrate 30 years of marriage this year. Yeah. You got to clap for her, not me. I'd like to think I'm a faithful dad. You can ask my son, Sam, sitting right there. Raise your hand, Sammy. He's my baby. You can ask him that whether I'm a faithful dad to prove me right or wrong here. But I try to make it a priority to be in their lives. I try to be influencing them, try to be there for them, help them out in any way, shape, or form, except for a check. They can work for that check. But I'm there for you. I'm praying for you, Sam. I'm praying for you. I'd like to think I'm a faithful friend. I try to invest in my friendships. I try to be there in the good and the bad. I still have work to do. But I think I'm making progress there. I think I'm a faithful follower of Christ as I do the things that I feel that draw me closer to him, not because I have to, but because I want to. And what I find interesting about this is the fact that God called me into ministry back in high school, and today I stand in front of you and I'm in ministry today. His will be done. I'm not getting paid. I'm not a full-time staff member. I'm just a volunteer. But I feel like I'm in ministry as just as much as anybody at Cornerstone. And I like to think I'm a faithful neighbor, but you're going to have to ask my neighbor about that. He's sitting right there too. Look at him. Yeah, well, you know what? We'll let that go. We'll let that go. Scratch that one from the list. But what I know is I needed to be a faithful man. I needed to adjust the bar to where I needed room for God and I needed to seek him to reach it. And I'm just telling you, I can reach higher than I've ever been able to reach before. Not because of me, but because of him. I am so thankful for you guys to be in this series because there's two things I know. Number one, you wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in being a faithful man. But number two, I also realize that some of you need to hear this message because there are parts of your life where you're setting the bar pretty low. In fact, you're setting the bar low to a point where there's no room for God. So my ask of you guys today as we close is simple. Will you check your bar? As you go back and look at the attributes from the previous series, and as you go through this series and look week to week, and you're kind of evaluating yourself, will you check your bar? Is it too low? Is there room for God? Are you asking God for help on that, setting that bar? And number two, I just want you guys to be honest. If you were with us in the previous series, I'm sure there was weeks where you walked away from this room saying, you know what, I got that, that's fine. Generosity, you know what, I give my 10%. I volunteer 2 hours a week. I got that. Can I just ask you, though, that if you're doing it, have you set that bar too low? Could you give more of your time, your talents, your finances? I think about JCPenney, the founder of the department store JCPenney. He had a unique take on this. He had an extremely strong faith, incidentally, but he did not tithe. He did not give 10%. He took it to an extreme and said, you know what, I'm going to live on 10%. And he gave the other 90% away. Now, granted, he was a millionaire, so 10% of them, it's still a lot of them. But the point here is, right, that shows his faith. He could have held on to that money as much as he wanted to. But he realized something, that to get to that high bar to where he was, to be in the position and to have the wealth that he had, he didn't do it himself. He had a high bar, and he honored God in that. So guys, as I close, I'm just going to say this. Faithful men set the bar high, leaving room for God to show up, and most importantly, seeking him to help you reach it. Amen. If you're new with us this week, we have questions on the table. This is your time to kind of debrief what we've talked about. If those questions are really bad because I wrote them, feel free to do your own questions, but really have that conversation. We'll come up in a few minutes to close us out with a prayer, but for right now, this is your time. Thank you guys very much, and God bless you all.